Hello, everyone. I'm Shahzeb Usman, and we welcome you to our conversation. Today, we will be discussing how third world approach to international law view the concept of development. We are joined by Marina Falcao. Marina is an environmental law litigator at a leading Brazilian environmental law firm. She has LLM in human rights and democratization from the University of Padova, Italy, under the international program of the Global Campus of Human Rights. She has published a book in 2021, which is titled as Participative Democracy in the World and in Brazil, a solution to the representative crisis. She has written quite frequently about indigenous laws in Latin America and environmentalism under the TWAIL perspective. Hello, Marina, how are you?
Hello, Muhammad.
Hope it's not too early in Brazil right now.
Well, it is a little bit at 7 a.m.
Well, sorry for disturbing you at such an early hour. We have huge time difference between Pakistan and Brazil. My first question is about the concept of development. How do you think this idea has evolved over centuries, especially in connotation and then in terms of political application?
So until 1949, the word development did not have a political connotation, just a biological one, which means that until that time, development was something very specific. It was very objective, scientific. It it was nothing else than a biological thing. So at that time, development meant the growth of an organism, so a plant or an animal. In this biological sense, development was thwarted whenever the plant or animal failed to fulfill its genetic program. So, in these cases of failure, the growth was not development, but an anomaly or a pathological behavior. And the sociological political meaning of the word development gained space only in January of 1949 with the famous speech of former President Truman of United States. And I will quote a portion of his speech. We must embark on a bold new program for marking the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial program available for the improvement of and growth of undeveloped areas. More than half the people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their food is inadequate. They are victims of diseases. Their economic life is primitive and stagnant. Their poverty is a handicap and a threat both to them and to more prosperous areas. This speech is very significant. So in this speech, we can see a lot of what development was going to be after it, because the economic life of more than half of the people in this planet was called primitive, stagnant, and a lot of theorics say that after this speech, in one day to another, 2 billion people just became underdeveloped.
Yeah.
And in this moment, these people stop being what they were in all their diversity and all their culture, their way of life to be only underdeveloped. And this was called as era of development.
Yeah.
At that time, with this speech, it began this era of development in which the world began to be divided in two, a developed world and an underdeveloped world.
Yeah.
So the view of the world was also divided in two, just in this economic view.
Yeah.
And which is, of course, under single value of economics of world organization, because it was just economic in a liberal point of view.
Yeah.
So people and countries which had money was developed, so they were fulfilled. They were already grown in the genetic point of view, because even though the social political meaning of development is different from the biological one, is also very similar, no? So the word development in a social political definition is very similar to the biological definition,
Yeah.
because when we say that a country or a people is not developed, it also wants to say that it didn't arrive and it didn't fulfill all their genetic potential. So this word also comes with a very linear way of thinking, in which everyone or peoples or countries or communities or everyone has a line of growth in in the sense of genetic program. So the developed country already achieved everything. They already achieved all the genetic potential of
Mm.
humankind, and the underdeveloped didn't.
Mm.
So in this view, also what the underdeveloped people need to achieve is development. They need
Yeah.
to become developed.
Yeah.
Of course, that the understanding shaped in international law and national legal systems are use all these definitions, and new definition of development shaped international law and national legal systems and transformed relations between countries, entered in the psyche of the colonizer and the colonized,
Yeah.
which is something that is very well studied in Frantz Fanon.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think like I find it very fascinating that after, the process of colonization ended, we were immersed in this urban life where we have a lot of, needs, urban needs. And all of them are related to, we need electricity, we need concrete, homes and everything. And all of them comes with a price. And anybody who doesn't have that kind of needs is considered underdeveloped in the language of the West. And I think that's very fascinating because that's how I think West has perpetuated class apartheid in countries like Pakistan or Brazil, because if you don't have that kind of capital, you can't access those needs. And if you can't have those skills, you can't prosperous in this kind of ecosystem. So I think this dichotomy of developed and underdeveloped has has caused extreme harm to the people in the global south. So my second question is, how do you view the concept of naturalism and positivism in international law theory to legitimize the tool of development to further colonize the global south? Because we have most of the time we have seen that philosophy is required to legitimize any kind of oppression. We need a certain kind of moral or philosophical reasoning to even tell ourselves how can we perpetuate the violence. So how do you view this concept of legal positivism and legal naturalism to create this idea of development?
Yeah, so although international law was from the beginning a set of rules intended to regulate relations between states, its application began to gain universality only in the 19th century. It is important to note that in the 19th century also was a very important period of Europe to expand its frontiers. It was a very imperial
Yeah.
moment for
Yeah.
Europe,
Yeah.
also because in 1878 was signed the Treaty of Berlin. It
Yeah.
is very recent, actually. And it was also at that time that positivism replaced naturalism in the main jurisprudential doctrine used to interpret and apply international law. So, according to the positivist understanding, the state is the main actor of international law, and only through its existence a people could claim sovereignty over its territory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's maybe today it makes sense,
Mm.
but of course at that time its implications were completely different. Because what is state? The concept of state was made by Europeans, and they were the people who could determine what was state and what people had something that could be called state.
Yeah.
So even though even though sovereignty um, could be something any people could claim, because well they could, like in Brazil we could say no, you cannot invade us because we have sovereignty, because we have a state. Now it's something that it looks rational, it looks fair. But back then the states were just the European states, or when they were coming to a place, they could see organization of people and say, okay, this is a state. But who were going to define that was the Europeans. And considering that it was a time in which they were imposing themselves in all peoples in Africa, um, well, actually, they could say, "Look, I can invade here because you don't have sovereignty, you don't have a state," which is, of course, a bit crazy to think right now.
Yeah.
But positivism was, in this sense, very well used to justify
Yeah.
colonization,
Yeah.
because you they could impose themselves in a place without states.
Yeah.
If they didn't have sovereignty, they also didn't have legal personality.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, they were not people in, like, they didn't have the same rights of other people who were under states. On the other hand, naturalism was not something that was okay. So it is not like positivism was something horrible and then positivism was something good for people. Positivism was used the same way as naturalism was used the same way as positivism was used, because naturalism assumed that legal personality came from natural law,
Yeah.
which was also defined by the Europeans. That is, it was born from the natural condition of human beings.
Yeah.
Um, and for the naturalists, these conditions were delimited mainly by the use of reason and customs.
Yeah.
The naturalism was very used in the colonization of America, and because, well, when they arrived in America and tried to colon and also actually could they oh, when they colonized America, they saw these people and they said, look, they cannot be considered as people under the law. They cannot be sovereign because their customs are crazy. There were some people in America who eat people, cannibalism.
Yeah.
They were There are some, not all and not most, but some were cannibalists, and they say no, this is against God. This is this is against natural law, because these customs and are crazy. They don't have reason. They don't think with reason. So they don't have natural law. So in the colonization of America, naturalism was very used to impose um, the European values, and in the colonization of Africa was the positivism used to impose these values. This is very well seen in the Valladolid controversy. This was a very important discussion which took place in Valladolid, Spain, between 1550 and 1551. On this occasion, on the one side there was Juan Gines de Sepulveda, and on the other side was Bartolomé de las Casas. Juan Gines de Sepulveda, he defended in favor of the Spaniards, saying that the Spanish invasion, the Spanish invasion was something fair, and they should impose themselves to the indigenous people in America because the natives were irrational, barbaric, and therefore they should be saved
Yeah.
by the from their incivility by the Spaniards.
Yeah.
Juan Gines de Sepúlveda said no, no. He was against it. He he defended um, that native people should have their basic rights protected,
Mm.
including the right to their lands, languages, religions, cultures,
Mm.
forms of organizations, because they were rational beings
Mm.
since they were made by God. So
Yeah.
he actually had a very good point, saying that God doesn't make mistakes. If God made these people, they are people,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? This was very important because actually it was was the first time that the right of native people in America was discussed.
Mm.
Of course, at this time, um, Juan Gisnes de Sepúlveda won the discussion, and actually all these. It's very interesting. We don't have time now, but it's very interesting that he actually Bartolomé de las Casas make he writes a book and also um, and make a list with all points that Juan Gines de Sepúlveda brings to support Spanish invasion in America. And it's very interesting because even though the invasion was of course something not only but mostly economical, was just to make Spanish rich, and they needed justification to the Spanish people. They need to say something because otherwise would be illegal. So they say
Mm.
no, this is legal, and all the arguments that Juan Gines de Sepúlveda gave was the justifications they gave to the Spanish people, and they still gave to the world in some kind.
Yeah. Yeah. I find this concept of, positivism and naturalism very, very interesting, because I think since positivism assumed the concept of state, and it's simply thinks that state is like the precursor of international law. It's like how international law is made, and I find that troubling because it totally ignores that state is mostly also an elitist body, and it doesn't represent all fractions of the society and the will of theirs, of the different fragments of society. At the same time, if you look at the naturalism, you see this idea of which again, most of the time, also elite perpetuates, that religion is somehow God given all the time, and that somehow certain kinds of divine rules are always made, and there are some uniform rules, and that provides legitimacy to their own interests, most of the time economic interests. So I think that I find positivism and naturalism both troubling in many contexts, and I think they can be misused, although they might not be bad in their own philosophies, but you can debate on it. But I think there is a misuse of both of them in certain parts of history. Um, this takes me to my third question, and again, sugarcoating sugarcoating the economic agendas in the vocabulary of human rights. We have seen that now the language of human rights is very powerful to provide legitimacy to certain economic interests again. So my third question is, how do you view the tool of human rights to perpetuate further the Western liberal economic theory, especially considering how they relate with the UN sustainable goals? Because we have seen that in UN sustainable development goals, there is a lot of talk about economic growth in a very traditional manner, and that links with the human rights idea too. So my question is, what do you think about this particular intersection?
Human rights were born as an arm of international law. becoming abiding legal system only after World War II, the same way as international law. Because that although these rights may be very different from other areas of international law, they are still part of this system and therefore bear many of its characteristics, in particular the model of an obligation of the liberal state built in the colonial context. So, of course, international law was born after World War II, just between European states. But as I said in the previous question, it claimed universality in the 19th century. In this context of imposition of European values in global South peoples. And human rights is part of international law. So even though it 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 doesn't need to bear all its characteristics, it it brings the main idea of international law, and of course it brings some of its characteristics and of its history and everything. So, and is quite clear that human rights adopt the model and obligation of the liberal state, which was built in a colonial context. So in this way, just like international law, human rights were also born based on the vision of a hegemonic model of power, in which the countries of the North have values and laws superior to those of the countries of the South, and which therefore must be imposed on the other peoples. So human rights, human rights can help to face human suffering, and it can do very good stuff. And I don't want to deny that. But it's important also to see and to criticize the side of human rights in which it sees the values and the the model of organization of global North as the desirable for everyone. It sees as the developed model of organization, the developed values, as if it was superior, and it helps to impose all of these thoughts in the global South. It doesn't mean that all values and the model of organization of global North it's in every way negative for the world, but of course we need to see that in a very critic perspective. So a classic example of this of everything what I'm saying is the inclusion of the Western economic model in the list of human rights. But it is also undeniable that human rights, as well as the political economic vision of development, are used to perpetuate a hegemonic colonial vision, in addition to serving as an instrument for the continued imposition of the Northern culture on the global South. So, and in this context, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a clear example of this, because, they seek to eradicate poverty through the implementation of liberal policies such as economic growth, goal number 8, and industry innovation and infrastructure, goal number 9. It's undeniable that human rights and the UN Sustainable Development Goals are very linked with the idea of the values of the North being more desirable to human life. And this imposition of this economic model is a very clear example of that. In this context, human rights are presented with the aim of being solutions for the development of underdeveloped countries, introducing them to the values and ways of life of development states, since they are considered preferable for the quality of human life. This idea can be exemplified by the Human Development Report of the UNDP, published for the first time in 1990. This report built the Human Development Index, which seeks to compare the level of development of 130 countries.
Yeah.
Just in that is we already can build some critics. So they seek to compare the level of development of 130 countries, placing them in a numerical list that goes from the most to the least developed. So
Yeah.
it's crazy because they use one list of parameters to compare 130 countries,
Yeah.
and we need to highlight
Hmm.
that 130 countries, how much diversity is inside of that, how
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
history, how much how all the diversity in terms of culture, language, um, everything. And you use to compare their development
Hmm.
and some unique parameters that you use to all of them.
Yeah.
In other words, this document aims to determine how far from the most successful country other countries are, in order to classify almost all nations in the world according to a single understanding of development.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with you. I think I find human rights, the idea of human rights, troubling because not because it says anything wrong. Most of the rights within it are quite, I think, acceptable. But I find it problematic because it is used for wrong reasons. Like almost all the evil, as we said, hides under some good perspective. I think human right has been used as a sugarcoating to further economic capitalism of the West. And we have seen that, especially in developing countries, the focus is on the political and civil rights. And there is almost no focus on ICESCR, the social and economic rights. And there is no universal right to work. There is very less focus on labor rights. And at the same time, I think it is also problematic because as you said, that it has caused a lot of distortion in terms of creating indigenous movements because a lot of more let's say there's a lot of cultural relativism that human rights, I think, does not really accept because again it performs universal standardization of morality, which I think most people in different cultures, maybe in the Muslim world or maybe in the indigenous part of the Latin America, or mostly in the Eastern countries, will not conform. It will go against their community style of thinking. So the idea of individualism within human rights is also, I think, quite problematic, and I think it links to this strengthening of the idea of development. So yeah, so I do understand your point, and I have my own views about human rights too, but I think I really like how you think about it. My next question is more about linking the idea of development with climate change and environment, because we have seen this development has caused extreme disaster on environment. So how do you view the intersection of environmentalism with development?
So, in the colonial period and until recently, deforestation was considered a civilizing act, which was seen as a demonstration of human superiority, more specifically of the white man over nature and other animals. Industrialization was seen as the most advanced stage of human development that could only be achieved by the strongest and most capable peoples.
Yeah,
Um, yes, in this way, deforestation was something very positive,
yeah,
was um, something that was proved that man could dominate dominate nature, could not dominate other animals. And when the Europeans came to America, it was also they saw the ecological way of living of some of the peoples of America, and they saw that as something that proved that they were inferior, because they were not imposing themselves so strongly as the European people over nature. And this was something seen as inferior, was lack of technology, was lack of development. Although not completely abandoned, these concepts have been changing, and deforestation is no longer considered a civilizing act, and ecology has become a necessity.
Yeah.
However, this change did not occur because of the simple benevolence of some countries towards the environment and other animals,
Yeah.
but because environmental degradation could affect industries and private companies, which would have limited the availability of resources necessary for their production.
Hmm.
So the ecological movement was not something so simple as countries or peoples who were good people and they were caring about the environment and about animals. But of course, it was so strongly introduced in the economical system, uh, economical liberal system that we live in now, because it was something very important for the
Yeah.
continuity of the economic liberal system,
Yeah.
and also the continuity of the idea of development. Because if the deforestation and the exploitation of the environment continued the same way as it was before, well, the natural resources would finish very soon,
Yeah.
and then the the industrialization and uh, the what we call development would be very limited.
Yeah.
It would be forced to stop. So it, the ecological movement came in so strongly right now because was not just to save the environment, but especially to maintain development, to sustain. So to sustain industrialization and development. So it's also very interesting
Hmm.
because when we say sustainable development, it is actually a strategy to sustain development. So in this perspective of preserving development, environmentalism could not appear as an obstacle. It was with this objective in mind that was drafted sustainable development. So sustainable development, as I just said, was with this objective of sustaining development. So this is why all the goals um, to all the goals of sustainable development are very linked with the economic liberal system. To reduce emissions and ensure environmental safety for people and industries, specific goals that would not limit economic growth in the North were set. In this perspective, the reduction of the global index of polluting gas emissions, for example, is not pursued through the reduction of emissions in the industrialized countries,
Hmm.
the largest on the planet,
Hmm.
but through efforts to reduce emissions in countries of the South.
All right, all right. Yeah, I find this very fascinating because we have seen that the Western countries are only focused on the reforestation of the global South rather than deindustrialization of their own economies. And they're asking us to, deindustrialize or and reforest, but they are not willing to do themselves. And they reap the benefit of colonization, they reap the benefit of industrial revolution, caused this mess, and now they are not willing to clean it up themselves, rather want us to clean it for them. So what do you think that how when we see that Western economies are only focused on the reforestation of the global South and not their own industrialization, how do you think this idea or this phenomena in terms of the third world approach to international law?
Reforestation is an excellent solution for more industrialized countries, since it does not affect their production and depends only on funding to be implemented,
Hmm.
especially when implemented in the countries of the South. As a result, the environmental issue began to be reduced to the aspect of forest conservation, thus distancing itself from concerns about the negative effect of industrialization. Reforestation is very convenient for the countries of the North because it does not affect the industries of the global North. Once they don't need to reduce their emissions, they are reforestating the South, so they don't
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
change the way of
Yeah.
production that they already had adopted. And it also is in the South. So actually, global North don't need to change anything.
Yeah.
They just need to bring their superior values to the South and save them to uh, from their incivility again.
Hmm.
Because in this view, global South doesn't know how to preserve their forest. They don't know how to be industrialized without killing everything. So they need to impose on global South and to bring their values to global South. Well, to teach them
Hmm.
how to be developed without killing everything, without exploring the nature so horribly, and
Yeah.
save them again. Of
Yeah.
course, I'm being very ironic, but this is the thought that is disseminated.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, redirection of industry attention to forests was accompanied by the reduction of environmental problem to a technical problem, whose solution would result from scientific technological sophistication, reviving the old prejudice that the peoples of the South are backward and technologically inferior, and should be saved by the countries of the North.
Hmm.
So, in this perspective, the environmental problem was not more a, it was not anymore a problem of over industrialization. So it was not more a problem that linked directly with industrialization, with this idea of development. Now it was a problem of scientific technological sophistication. It was a problem linked with science.
Yeah.
So we can achieve this environmental goal, bring electric cars, improving the way we produce plastic. So
Hmm.
uh, actually, in this example, substituting plastic with another material that is more technological than plastic.
Yeah.
So the eyes were again turned to the North, which should bring all this technology to the world and save the world from the catastrophe of um, environmental crisis.
Yeah.
So this strategy of the countries of the North to intervene in the countries of the South to save the environment, as is the case of international project on the Amazon,
Yeah.
is very convenient for those states since it does not affect their industrialization methods, and quite the contrary, actually.
Hmm.
It allows its perpetuation
Yeah.
and even generates employment for its citizens, since a large part of the funds created for this purpose are designated for consultancy and project coordination, which are tasks performed mostly by Europeans and North Americans.
Yeah.
So environmentalism is something very important. We should think about it, and we should not leave industrialization and development how it is right now. But we need to criticize it and see that environmentalism cannot be just a tool for sustained development,
Yeah.
but it should be seen as something separate from it.
Yeah, I like these ideas. And I think that how we have seen that the third world is reacting to this kind of policies, that is, I think, very important because I don't think so. We have seen a very united response or voice from the third world when it comes to these kind of policies. We have rising powers in the global south, such as Brazil, who have, this kind of thinking. We saw the election of President Lula in Brazil, and we see a certain kind of anti-liberal policies in some global south countries, such as Brazil. But I think we don't really find a very united response to such policies. And until and unless we have that, I don't think so that we can stop the countries of global north in creating these policies which perpetuate their imperialism and their liberal economic and political policies. So I do understand your point and I agree with it with my own little input. Thank you so much, Marina, for coming to our podcast. I know English is not your first language, rather, it's Portuguese and Italian. And you have done most of your legal studies and academic work in Portuguese and Italian. So I really appreciate you coming to our podcast, talking to us in English, and also waking up at such an early hour for our podcast.
Thank you, Muhammad, for inviting me here. I really love talking about this topic, and I really enjoyed participating on your podcast.